Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start with just a welcome. Welcome to Cross Pollinations. Again, I'm Nick Brewer. I'm the Administrative Director at the League of Canadian Poets. We've been organizing this series with the Canadian Association for Health Humanities, and I am very excited about this evening's event. We have Maryam Golafshani and Jody Chan here to present to you. And I'm just going to start with a land acknowledgement. I am in Toronto. The League of Canadian Poets is located in Toronto, but as we know, everyone is tuning in from all over the place. So rather than providing a traditional land acknowledgement, I'm actually going to read part of a poem by Joy Harjo that was brought to my attention recently and which I think is stunning. It is called Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings by Joy Harjo. Sorry, I've been alone all day and I have not spoken to anybody until now. And I'm going to read part one of this poem. 1. Set conflict resolution ground rules. Recognize whose lands these are on which we stand. Ask the deer, turtle, and the crane. Make sure the spirits of these lands are respected and treated with goodwill. The land is a being who remembers everything. You will have to answer to your children and theirs. The red shimmer of remembering will compel you up the night to walk the perimeter of truth for understanding. As I brushed my hair over the hotel sink to get ready, I heard, by listening, we will understand who we are in this holy realm of words. Do not parade, pleased with yourself. You must speak in the language of justice. That's just part one of this 6-part poem, Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings by Joy Harjo. I've provided a link where you could read it online if you'd like to in the chat on Poetry Foundation. And without any further chattering from me, I'm going to go ahead and let Maryam kick us off.
Hey everyone, I'm going to share my screen in a minute, but first I'm just going to share an accessibility copy of my talk in the chat, so if anyone wants to follow along there, you can also read. And sharing this. Oh, sorry, I just got a new computer, so now it's like I have to give this permission. Okay, so sorry, I just got a new computer. It says I have to quit and reopen. I'm gonna be back in like half a second.
No worries. Thank you, Lisa, for your land acknowledgement in our chat here. And Jody as well, thank you. Thank you, Alice.
I'm gonna share my screen now. It should work. Okay, here we are. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. I'm gonna start with a land acknowledgement of my own because I think it's relevant to the kind of survey I'm gonna be doing of literature and theory that's influenced me over the years. So I'm here as a settler and have lived my entire life on land that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. This talk is largely a reflection on my training in literature and critical theory during my time at Western University, which is located on the territory of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenape-Wauk, and Attawandaron People Nations. I'm forever indebted to the work of many brilliant and generous Indigenous writers and thinkers whom I was first introduced to during my time at Western, albeit that was often in spite of, not because of, my mostly Western education. Pun very much intended. These writers and thinkers include Eden Robinson, Leanne Betasamasak Simpson, Billy Ray Belcour, Audra Simpson, Jeff Barnaby, Glenn Coulthard, and many others, as well as my equally brilliant and generous Indigenous classmates. I hope to pay this debt forward through my medical practice, while both as a student for now and as a physician later, in ways that actively work to undo the violence colonial medicine has done and continues to do to Indigenous peoples across this genocidal settler nation state we call Canada. This includes the Canadian medical system's complicity in the genocide of thousands of Indigenous children who were violently forced through the Indian residential school system. This is documented, first and foremost, in stories and trauma Indigenous people hold amongst themselves and are immensely generous when they sometimes choose to share those with settlers like me. There's also a wealth of academic work on the topic, including Maureen Lux's book, Separate Beds, A History of Indian Hospitals in Canada, 1920 to 1980, which I recommend reading if you are, like me, a settler who needs to keep doing work. I'm now halfway through medical school at the University of Toronto, which is located on the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas Credit, not to mention the countless other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who live here now. During this time, I'm striving to learn as much as I can from Indigenous physicians like Dr. Lisa Richardson, Dr. James McCocus, Dr. Chase McMurrin, Dr. Marcia Anderson, and Dr. Suzanne Schuch, among many others, as well as my own Indigenous classmates, including those from Indigenous nations beyond Turtle Island, like Palestine. It's not the varied and nuanced Indigenous healing practices that are the so-called alternative medicine here. Those are the medicines of this place. And what I am mostly learning at U of T is what's actually alternative, the colonial alternative. But some may say, you are here at medical school to become a doctor. What has that got to do with literature, with philosophy, with poetry? I'll try to explain. In 2014, I was assigned Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own in an introductory course on feminist theory. It was my first time reading anything by Woolf, and it was my first time ascending into madness. I was captivated by her first word, but, by her first sentence, a question, and by her first use of I will try to explain, she writes, in response to her own question about what A Room of One's Own has got to do with women in fiction. Woolf is not going to explain, but will try to explain. This distinction matters. Further down that first page, she continues, I should never be able to come to a conclusion. I should never be able to fulfill what is, I understand, the first duty of a lecturer. To hand you after an hour's discourse a nugget of pure truth to wrap between the pages of your notebooks and keep on the mantelpiece forever. At 19 years old, just in my second year of university, I was stunned by Woolf's words. Her questions, her open hesitations, her meandering thoughts, her use of but, her rejection of everything I'd been taught a good essay required, let alone good writing or even good thinking. I didn't know it at the time, but Woolf offered my first lesson on doctoring. I should never be able to come to a final, decisive conclusion when encountering patients. I should never be able to fulfill what is, I understand, the supposed first duty of a doctor. To hand the patient after a 10-minute appointment a nugget of pure truth, a fact about their body-mind. I will try to listen and perhaps explain. I will try to care, treat, cure, and manage a suffering body-mind, but I will never, ever fully understand what it really is to live in that particular body-mind. Woolf goes on to write that she is going to develop, in our presence, as fully and freely as she can, the train of thought which led her to think this being her argument about women needing money and a room of their own to write fiction. When a subject is highly controversial, and any question about sex is that, one cannot hope to tell the truth. One can only give one's audience the chance of drawing their own conclusions as they observe the limitations, the prejudices, the idiosyncrasies of the speaker. The subject of doctoring, of what makes a good doctor, is also highly controversial. So taking Woolf's lead, I can only hope for my talk to give you the chance to draw your own conclusions about what makes a good doctor. And I will try to do so by developing here, in your presence, my own train of thoughts and experiences that led to these partial conclusions as fully and freely as I can. It's taken nearly a decade for me to understand, if even partially, what it is to live in my own unruly body-mind, but I'll try to explain. By 2015, I had moved to Scotland to study at the University of St. Andrews for a year. I arrived in St. Andrews mildly mad from that previous year, but also mildly depressed as I began to come down from what I would later learn to be my very first hypomanic episode. There was perhaps no better place to experience such intensities of emotion than at a historic seaside town perched on cliffs looking out over the North Sea, a frigid, turbulent, but stunning expanse. The town and university, founded in 1413, truly look like they're out of a storybook. The roads are paved with cobblestones. Every building and home looks like a castle to my suburban North American sensibilities. Breathtaking gardens and quads could be found around every corner, and the entire town was framed by stunning golf courses, beaches, ravines, and even rolling hills with sheep. Even many years later, St. Andrews would still find ways to overwhelm and surprise me with its beauty. I enrolled in a course focused entirely on Virginia Woolf's writing with two of the most eminent Woolf scholars. I knew the opportunity to study Woolf with those professors in a classroom overlooking the North Sea was a magnificent privilege. And yet, as a depressive fog settled in around my mind that fall, I could barely take in any of the lectures, let alone any of the texts we were assigned to read. I barely remember anything I read that semester, but I do remember struggling to absorb Woolf's words as I sat in my favorite cafe on dark, rainy afternoons and evenings as the sun began setting earlier and earlier into the winter. I was suffering in a way I had never experienced before, and yet it's still so easy to look back and romanticize those days. There's a temptation to draw poetic parallels between the unpredictable storm that was brewing in my mind and St. Andrew's own descent into its predictably dark, stormy winter. And there's also the temptation to draw a poetic parallel between Woolf's words, so often reflective of her own manic depressive illness, and my own. In To the Lighthouse, there's a particularly haunting description of an empty home on Scotland's Isle of Skye as it is ravaged by a storm. Night after night, summer and winter, the torment of storms, the arrow-like stillness of fine, had there been anyone to listen. From the upper rooms of the empty house, only gigantic chaos streaked with lightning could have been heard tumbling and tossing, as the winds and waves disported themselves like the amorphous bulks of leviathans, whose brows are pierced by no light of reason, and mounted one on top of another, and lunged and plunged in the darkness or the daylight. For night and day, month and year ran shapelessly together in idiot games, until it seemed as if the universe were battling and tumbling, in brute confusion and wanton lust aimlessly by itself. Despite my depression at the time, I still remembered this passage, if only in a vague sense. Not the specific words, but the mood it stirred up in me, even if I could only name that mood in retrospect. In their poem Ode to My Depression, Chan writes, "The best way to survive a storm is with your eyes wide open." But it took me many more storms to figure that out. To the Lighthouse is more a novel about philosophical introspection than storylines and characters. There's an allure to transforming my own descent from mild mania into depression into a similarly beautiful metaphor of a stormy evening threatening to overcome an empty home, one filled only with deep introspective thoughts. But I have to stop myself. There was no profound introspection occupying my mind at the time, just profound sadness, hopelessness, and confusion. There wasn't anything romantic about my first descent into major depression, just as there isn't anything romantic about Woolf being a stunningly creative and talented writer who died far too young of manic depressive illness. This was the second lesson Woolf offered me on doctoring. Illness tempts romanticization at every turn, and yet that is too easy and sometimes even dangerous. I must resist erasing the seriousness of suffering. But not all illness tempts romanticization in the same way or equally. As Chan teaches me in yet another poem, not all sick is equal. Manic depressive illness, or bipolar disorder as we know it today, has a particularly storied history of romanticization due to its relationship with artistic creativity. In her book, Touched with Fire, Kay Redfield Jamison traces this history and makes the case that while it is tempting to think of manic depression as a symptom of artistic genius, or more dangerously, perhaps, as a driver of such creativity, it actually more often wreaked unbearable suffering, unproductivity, and even death upon artists from Van Gogh to Woolf. It's tempting to think the world would not have been blessed with these artists' brilliant works if they hadn't been ill. But perhaps we would have actually had even more brilliant work had they not suffered so greatly and not died so young. And regardless, no amount of creative work for us to consume now can ever justify someone having had to suffer so greatly to create it in the first place. And yet, so many do manage to create beauty out of, in the midst of, or even in spite of illness and suffering. By the time I made it through a couple more cycles of hypomania and depression, I was in graduate school, during which time I read Maggie Nelson's Bluets, a startlingly beautiful work that explores the complexities of suffering. I ended up opening my master's thesis with a passage from Bluets, where Nelson describes not only her own suffering, but that of a friend she is closely caring for. I do not feel my friend's pain, but when I unintentionally cause her pain, I wince as if I hurt somewhere, and I do. Often in exhaustion, I lay my head down on her lap in her wheelchair and tell her how much I love her, that I'm so sorry she's in so much pain, pain I can witness and imagine, but that I do not know. She says, if anyone knows this pain besides me, it is you and Jay, her lover. This is generous, for to be close to her pain has always felt like a privilege to me, even though pain could be defined as that which we typically aim to avoid. Illness, like pain, could also be defined as that which we typically aim to avoid. I did not choose to be close to my own illness, yet I did choose to be here in medical school, close to the illnesses of so many others, with the privilege and authority to attempt to care for them. Yet I still feel wholly inadequate in my ability to do so. I spent the last 2 years primarily studying basic clinical, medical, and scientific knowledge, and I'll spend the next 2 years applying that knowledge in clinical settings. While such an education may adequately prepare me to treat disease, I worry that I still won't be prepared to care for the people who are ill because of those diseases. I worry that my medical education will not teach me what to do when I cannot cure the disease, or when a cure is not enough. Frankly, I'm not sure that a cure is ever enough, just as Wolf taught me that a conclusion is never enough. I always worry that my medical education will obscure the privilege it is to be close to people experiencing illness by obscuring those people beneath their diseases. I worry that I will think of myself as the generous one, as the one offering the coveted cure, the nugget of truth, and forget that the patients are the generous ones, the ones offering me the privilege to be close to them and their illness. I worry that I will know a patient's disease, but not know their illness, what it means to be ill, how they experience illness, how illness affects their lives and those around them. But I also wonder if I need or should or even can know a patient's illness in order to care for them. Perhaps to care for patients is to recognize their illness as that which I may witness and imagine but do not know, as Maggie Nelson does with her friend's pain. Perhaps it is the literature and theory I've read, and all I've yet to read, that will most adequately prepare me for the privilege of caring for those who are ill. And so it is from Maggie Nelson that I get my third lesson on doctrine. It is the patient, not I, who is the generous one in our encounter, the one who invites me to be close to them, their illness, their suffering, their life. I can perhaps witness and imagine their experience of illness, but no amount of closeness will ever let me wholly know it. And yet somewhere in there, in between what we might call empathy and appropriation, I, the doctor-to-be, must find a way to care for the ill. And somewhere in this space between where we touch, the patient and their suffering, me and my medical expertise, is where I seek beauty. Crashing from my latest episode of hypomania during medical school, I found myself in the bath ignoring my upcoming anatomy exam and instead reading my Where Things Touch, a meditation on beauty by Bahar Orang, a poet and psychiatry resident. She writes, I asked for beauty, and among bodies in pain, illusions of irreproachability between linoleum floors and white lights is where I ended up. A bit further along, she continues, that many physicians, especially trainees, share my desire to think about beauty instead of suffering, or rather to integrate beauty into reflections on suffering. I'll learn that many of us already understand instinctively that in place of suffering, there are islands of beauty, and not sentimentality, not cliche, beauty. All of us in any clinic or hospital, patients and caregivers, we are starved for it, beauty. I came to medical school through the beauty of literature's vulnerable intimacy, especially when such literature put words to vulnerability in illness, in suffering, in trauma, but also in healing and living fiercely in spite of. There's a place in which representations of such vulnerability slips into trauma porn, a commodification of it. But I hold, perhaps naively, onto the possibility for sincere beauty in sharing and attending to such vulnerability. I now realize that in coming to medicine, I want to get even closer to this beauty, as if it could become something more than just words on a page. In seeking beauty and vulnerability, in suffering and illness, I do not seek to romanticize or even assuage it. I seek to hold space for, perhaps even touch, that suffering that exceeds my understanding of it. My love for literary analysis comes not from wanting to understand a text, but rather following how it understands itself, and in turn, how we, the readers, then come to understand ourselves. Sometimes the excess is contradictory or uncomfortable or strange, and that is okay. The violence of medicine, its ugliness, is its constant denial of such excess through the illusion of understanding, of final conclusions, of bodily facts. Oran goes on to describe a moment of touching between herself and Frida Kahlo's famous painting, La Columna Rota. Here she offers an example of how we might encounter Kahlo's pain, her work's beauty, and its successes. Kahlo's not looking for empathy or excavation. She doesn't want my OT, PT, MD. I can only receive her in our estrangement. It would be violence to mine her for something that connects us in order to love her or to care. As Virginia Woolf says about the person in pain, Kahlo opens herself up to me, or at me, or near me, to be just held in solitude. Orang invites us to know BP here is not to know Kahlo's experience, to empathize with or excavate her, but rather to know that her experience exceeds such understanding. And it does not simply exceed it, but rejects it and names it as violence, leaving, paradoxically, a chasm of estrangement through which to touch her, to love her, to care for her. Bahar's words get us back to where we started, to Woolf. But Bahar's words also move me forward to a fifth lesson on doctoring. Knowing a patient's experience of illness cannot be the prerequisite of care. In other words, empathy is excavation, as the violence of mining another for a point of connection in order to care for that other is not really care. Something else must come first. In medical school, we're socialized to empathize in the same way we're implicitly taught to approach everything, to understand it, to expose it to our gaze and investigations, to pick it apart, to appropriate and assimilate it, and to ultimately master it. To master not only medical knowledge of the body-mind, but also the experiences of the person who lives in that body-mind. I've experienced this firsthand as I've witnessed classmates ask well-intentioned yet invasive questions about why mentally ill patients act or think in XYZ ways. As I sit there listening to my classmates trying to understand, perhaps even trying to empathize with an illness that I already understand through intimate lived experience, I can't help but flush with shame. In their poem titled Therapist's Notes, Chan asks, "What color is your shame?" Mine is the pale caramel of the silk scarf I wrap my hair in each night and find unraveled on the bed next to me each morning. I've been thinking and writing about shame a lot these past few months, which led me back to Touching Feeling by Eve Sedgwick. She theorizes shame as a performance where one absorbs and acts out the emotions others have towards them. In this way, I began to think about shame as functioning in the opposite direction as empathy. Whereas empathy reaches towards understanding the feelings of another, shame pulls another's feelings, often negative ones, into oneself. But this seems too easy, leading me too close to the overdetermined logic of empathy as not only an antidote to shame, but all of medicine's ills. I then turn to Sarah Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion, where she theorizes how the subject of shame takes in the view, that is the feelings, the judgments, of how they appear or are supposed to appear to real or imagined others, and thereby see themselves as if they are the other. In this way, I started to see how empathy is not always so benevolent and can actually work in the same direction as shame. The empathizing self also takes in the view of a real or imagined other's feelings and experiences, seeing themselves as if they actually are that other with whom they seek to empathize with. With shame, this process results in producing the one who is being shamed as other. Meanwhile, with empathy, this process results in producing the one who is being empathized with as other. This is how empathy, at least in the reductive way it's often mobilized in medicine, risks getting in the way of caring for another. It can reproduce or defer the othering, moving us farther, not closer to care. So if empathy is not necessarily the way forward to care, then what is? I find a possible answer by staying with Sedgwick and Ahmed, or staying with the trouble, as Donna Haraway might say. Back in that same year, I first read Woolf's A Room of One's Own. I also read Eve Sedgwick's seminal essay on paranoid versus reparative reading for the first time. It's one of those essays that keeps pulling me back, and here I was thinking about it yet again in new ways as I prepared for this talk. In the essay, Sedgwick writes how paranoid inquiry is only one way, among other ways, of seeking, finding, and organizing knowledge. despite seeming to having increasingly become the only way. She goes on to characterize paranoid reading and writes, "The first imperative of paranoia is there must be no bad surprises," by which she means that paranoid inquiry is always already anticipating all that is bad. Medicine is always already anticipating all that is wrong with the body-mind. To read from a reparative position, however, is to surrender the knowing, anxious, paranoid determination that no horror shall ever come as new. It can seem realistic and necessary to experience surprise because there can be terrible surprises. However, there can also be good ones. Because the reader has room to realize that the future may be different from the present, it is also possible for her to entertain such profoundly painful, profoundly relieving, ethically crucial possibilities as that the past, in turn, could have happened differently from the way it actually did. Reading those passages anew, I was struck for the first time how much they echoed Ahmed's theorizing in her book Strange Encounters, another text I find myself going back to over and over and over again. For Ahmed, such a generous reading or encounter is also a meeting between two elements that involve surprise, a meeting between a reparative reader and a text, for example, or perhaps two people, a doctor and a patient. Ahmed writes that such a generous encounter is not a meeting between already constituted subjects who know each other. Rather, the encounter is premised on the absence of a knowledge that would allow one to control the encounter or to predict its outcome. The surprising nature of encounters can be understood in relation to the structural possibility that we may not be able to read the bodies of others. My literary education has not taught me to read the bodies of patients, but rather, more crucially, to recognize that I may not or cannot. To borrow Chan's words again, I once thought any wound could be healed if I knew how to describe it. But it's not so simple. Further on, Ahmed writes, "A generous encounter may be in such a way that the one who is already assimilated can still surprise, can still move on beyond the encounter which names her and holds her in place. Surprise makes room in the encounter for the beauty that a wrong describes, an access that is free to take others or us or both elsewhere entirely. Maybe this is what it means for something to move you. Maybe this is what it means for Maggie Nelson to name generosity in the closeness of her friend's pain. Maybe this is what it means for Woolf to surprise us by starting her essay with but and taking us somewhere we didn't expect. Maybe this is what it means to care." So it is Ahmed and Sedgwick who offer me a sixth and final, for this talk at least, lesson on doctoring. Care should be predicated upon being generous and not knowing, in allowing oneself to be surprised by that which is still unknown and ultimately unknowable. I want to walk into the 1,000th room with a patient with depression and still be surprised by what I find. To still not fully know what depression is for that person, despite my wealth of medical knowledge, personal experience, and mindful of literary representations. I want to be moved by that surprise to care for that person, not just their depression, justly, ethically, creatively, and tenderly. This past winter, while in the depths of my own worst cycle of depression, I met one of my psychiatry mentor's patients who we'll call Kay. At the level of the DSM's diagnostic categories, if we're to take them seriously, our mental illnesses are on the same spectrum. I've continued to join Kay's appointments for months now as she works through narrative therapy. She knows I share some of her experience, even if only just a sliver. Even after all these months working together, I still continue to be surprised at every appointment. I'm still surprised each time by Kay's generosity in inviting me into her life so intimately, so closely, and entrusting me with her care. I'm surprised every time by what new insights Kay offers about her experience of illness and what new insights those reveal about my own. I'm surprised by that my love for literature and training in literature, as well as my own illness experience, really are assets in caring for another, not just in theory, but in practice. Even after a decade working with Kay, my psychiatry mentor still seems surprised too. And even Kay still finds herself surprised at what she's able to do, to think, to say, to change, and to feel. Somewhere in the midst of the pain, the violence, the reductiveness, the overburdened systems, and all the other limitations of medicine as we know it, we found our own island of beauty where the three of us can hold on to that surprise and ultimately hold on to each other, to care. Thank you.
so much, Maryam. That was stunning and gripping and left me with so much to think about. And anyone who didn't open the accessibility copy of her talk in Google Docs, I highly recommend it. I was following along and it's just beautifully written as well. So if you, like me, want to return to that talk, highly recommend doing so. So I think, does anyone have any questions specifically for Maryam? My heart is saying that I would love to go right into Jody's reading, but I'm but a host. So if anyone has any questions for Maryam specifically, there will be a discussion period afterwards where you can ask questions to Maryam and Jody. I will share the link for you again here. Charles, sorry, has asked how to access the talk. So I'm just going to share the link in the chat again. Thank you, Maryam, for providing that. I'm not seeing any questions come up. So my heart gets to, oh, okay. Charles, you have a question. That's all right, you can type it and I will read it out. Charles is wondering if you have come across Emmanuel Levinas or Levinas, Levinas, and his work around the face.
Yeah, also, first of all, I'm so sorry. Has my mic been terrible this whole time?
It sounds like you're in the wind, but only when you're talking. So I truly don't know what could possibly be the issue.
Maybe it's because I have like a million fans on because I'm melting. I'm so sorry, everyone. Also, I had to just get a new laptop. But yeah, I actually wrote a whole chapter of my master's thesis on Emmanuel Levinas and specifically Sarah Ahmed's reading of his work. So that's super cool that you picked up on that because, yeah, the stuff about the encounter and the moment of surprise, that part of Sarah Ahmed's book, Strange Encounters, is specifically her rereading of Levinas. So like, you're super spot on. Thanks for mentioning that. Yeah.
Thank you, Charles. Okay, Jody, I think you're up. Okay, great. I was trying to figure out the host control for stopping the screen share. So Jody, oh, I muted your audio. Just 1 second, I will unmute you. Oops, no, where'd you go? Oh no. Can you unmute from your phone? Sorry, I didn't. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry about that. Jody Chan.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen also so you can follow along as I'm reading. And I'm also putting in a link to a document where you can read. So yeah, whichever way feels easiest or most helpful for you. And before I start, I wanted to also say, calling in today from Anishinaabe land in what's known as North Bay. Normally, I'm also in Toronto or Toronto, Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe land. And yeah, I think it's really important to think about that in this work and in this conversation and how the medical and psychiatric and carceral systems are so intertwined and are used as tools to enact genocide and colonial violence, and how when we're talking about disability justice and madness, that those things, that there cannot be disability justice without Indigenous sovereignty. So I'm really excited to be here and to be in conversation with Maryam, also thinking about care a lot and what those different forms of care can look like inside and outside of these institutions. So, I'm going to share my screen now. We'll do the right thing. Cool. Okay. I hope that works. And I'm going to read 4 or 5 poems, I think, depending on the time. The Caring Economy. Onions caramelizing in your cast iron, banana pancakes, the morning after, zines exchanged for a massage, almond oil on my hips, universal dental insurance, access details in the event description, advice on scamming the university to get free therapy. When I was a child, I didn't know children could be protected. Now, all the littles in my life, a luminous riot. Library books before and during bath time, teaching me how to live. The question, new and not unwelcome on your lips. Where do you not want to be touched? Even if I can't answer yet, patience, your attention like a whetstone. Falling in love with an old friend, and hope like an empty bathtub, wide enough for 2. Westbound sunsets on DuPont, Saturday cartoons, chocolate cookies, onesies, talking you through anxiety attacks. Time to be, middle spoon, trimming pine to build a trellis for a struggling tomato plant. Tulip blooms abundant beside the sidewalk for no reason. Slow healing. Elders distributing water bottles at the Mad Pride rally. Communal painkillers. Syncopated support. Care enough for everybody. Coloring books full of affirmation. Age play. Frosted grass underfoot in the day's first hours. Safety plans that disavow institutions. Instead, I cite my friends' phone numbers. We protect each other with permission. Strangers who ask how you are and want the truth. The question of pleasure. My fingertips, little to a single point of fire, ravenous for proof. Your voice insisting, I'm right here. Your nose, your forehead, too close to see clearly, except by the light of my touch-thirsty hands. I'm just going to give a quick content note for this next one for mentions of violence. Unhaunted. Say it to the snow. Say it to the still hot bullet. Say it to the subway tunnel when you consider jumping into the approaching light. The future reeks of repetition and you are afraid to commit. Before you sleep, say it to the empty belly of your bedroom. When you can't read the language on your grandmother's grave, say it. In flashbacks, he thrums in you, a bayonet through stone, but he left you your bones, a hook to hang each jagged memory. Your calloused throne, your first and last home. For years, you strip yourself from photographs, how they remind you of him and what he wanted and what he stole, and of her body and her body and her body, veining the hallway floor in hair and blood. Say your lineage is a long braid of women untwining in his hands, his father's, his grandfather's, uprooting a sapling, polishing the rifle, ripping the cotton skin of a dress. You bear their names like heavy ropes, say it. Find your waist in white ribbon. History seams are tearing. You learn violence as the sweetest love, but you learn from the wrong people. You drop your voice into the ocean and it keeps falling. A red roar, a battle noise, the procession of faces you memorize by night as if loss is enough to make you love them, and it is. Once, you and your mother lay alone, 2 hospital floors apart as she stopped breathing. Once, you stitched silence into your skin, but now the fabric is unspooling. You are bending to the slow arc of a drumbeat, generations wide. One day at a time, a single star spinning. Your fingers, your mother's, your grandmother's. Stealing dough, dabbing toothpaste off the mirror, pulling songs from a lover's wrist. Say the secret. Say it to the unhaunting sky. Say your hungriest wish. Say today I surrender to living. Say grace. Say rage. Say water and elegy. I remember. I remember. I remember you. This next poem, I was really, appreciative, Maryam, of how you're talking about kind of questioning what so-called like alternative medicine is, and how a lot of what is learned in med school is a colonial alternative. And when I was writing this poem, I was thinking a lot about that, and about these home remedies and things kind of passed down through generations in families, and how this has also been kind of one of the easiest, most familiar ways for me to connect with my family and with my lineage, is kind of through these like practices of care that isn't kind of named as care necessarily, but just like, oh, have you had hot water today? Have you had ginger? Did you put ginger in your tea? Those kinds of things. This is home remedies. Simmer ginger with a slice of sugar. Slice ginger into congee with green onions and stock. Boil ginger with lemon and Coke. Paint your congested chest with tiger balm. Paint the city with tulips. Dissolve lemon and honey in hot water. Gargle salt in hot water. Chase your meds with hot water. Chase your meds with chicken soup, herbs and acupuncture. Favorite memories, springtime tulips. Raise a garden of herbs in the kitchen. Raise a family of tulips in the ashtray. Lay a terrace of tulips in the hospital lobby. Erect a monument of tulips in the bedroom. Coax a shroud of tulips from her grave. A pall of tulips hangs heavy in the sky. Play an anthem about a lonely tulip. Dance and a flag of tulips lifts from your skin. A fountain of tulips erupts in your lungs. Your breath is replaced by tulips. Her blood is hijacked by a field of tulips. Sing of the last tulip you held. Give your child her name. The next piece that I want to read from, it's an excerpt from a longer poem, kind of exploring experiences around queer femme suicidality, kind of my own, but also people in my chosen family and in community. And yeah, here I also want to connect back to something that Maryam, you said about kind of not romanticizing suffering or illness or madness. And yeah, I really think about that a lot as an artist too, who I've also had those kind of internalized stories about art and madness and the way that those intertwine. But at the same time, here I wanted to talk about the ways that kind of mad and sick and disabled people are able to build really beautiful, creative networks and structures of caring for each other, and making sure that each other survive, and kind of honoring those and showing that there is joy, and kind of life affirming kind of care and beauty in that, while at the same time kind of calling attention to like needing to abolish kind of existing colonial and oppressive systems that are ableist and violent in that way. So yeah, content note for suicidality. Oh, and I'll start with two quotes. Yeah. Queer femme suicide is not a side note to the struggle. Leah Lakshmi Pepsna Samarathinga. Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions. Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Wanting to die transforms time and space in that there is no longer a map. That home is on the other side of leaving. That growing up, I folded into corners to not be seen. I'm tempted to write you here as in you, dangerous, dysfunctional, manipulative, too much. The lies you believe about yourself, you learn from someone else. To take the dog out, to breathe, to bathe, to unplug the sink. the tasks of basic survival begin to stretch out across days. During an episode, I wander phoneless, shoeless, for hours, trying to explain myself to myself. Like falling in love, wanting to die is considered feminine, weak. The blast radius of suicidality is that the one in pain becomes a scapegoat. I let the kombucha ferment too long, find maggots in the SCOBY. The house consumes its own light. I swallow theory like it can save me. I can barely think outside of writing, let alone feel. I lean too romantically on process. My mind is a boat, digesting itself plank by plank. When my parents settled here, they changed names between airports as if to delete history. I afford rent on the house I live in. This land is not my home. The words I have for this are always changing. I gather longing like dictionary entries. Ancestor, a deficit mentality. Horizon, the moment you realize you have traveled in the wrong direction for hours. I memorize, repeat. By the time I meet the psychiatrist, I have tried to die twice. My existence is an accident of accumulation. Every verse I compose, an incident of public or private ruin. I don't know if two is too many, so I don't ask. Nothing is settled in me. Not the way the line breaks, not the half-life of grief. Dreaming otherwise is as essential as food for us to survive. Lydia Hartman. To swim nude in the river in September, to sweat the eggplant overnight, who amass inhalers, benzos, antipsychotics to share, who goodbye their last grandparent over Zoom, who know the hotline numbers and that they are not enough, who populate the Google Doc knowing meeting agendas are an investment in the future, who beg prescription refills, unashamed by need, who bleed their radiant blood for tests every other month, who know not to hospitalize, who see the days ahead of me, who drive out to Tommy Thompson, who gather rocks for grounding, the memory of August sunset on geese on water. We stumbled on 2 cottontails that day, nearly tangling underfoot, who tether me, who mother me, from breath to breath, when I lose time, when I don't know that I am, who offer me a room to stay, who offer me their backs to touch, who make my bed while I'm out buying groceries, who nourish the conditions for dreaming, knowing someday the time for dreaming will be a radical kinship, an interdependent sociality, a politics of care. Contradictions in suicide intervention. It is not your responsibility to save anyone. It is not revolutionary or radical to let someone die who is already abused and neglected by the systems we live in. Hiding your pain can kill you. Being perceived as too much can kill you. It is okay to feel nothing. It is okay not to feel. I am afraid of dying. I am not afraid to die. This poem changes nothing. This poem has a demand. A demand requires a target. A target is a flag, feet planted in a beautiful garden. You cannot bypass the grief. The grief must move through you. The grief must sink, sting, molder, saturate, settle, sediment, thunder, before it can mother you. We humans, needful creatures, need others to survive. No one can save you but yourself. It is not your responsibility to save anyone. It is not revolutionary to let yourself die. In the quiet season, there are questions to confront. A demand requires the discipline to dream. For a time, I could not be left alone with pen or pill. I tried to break a street lamp with my head. Then I named myself after you. Space maker, time taker, ceaseless heart. For now, I know I'm not ready to be an ancestor. My grief about femme suicide is the garden where our future grows. The task merely is to make possible. Finally, I can admit you and you and you, gardeners of the inside joke, the living room institution. I dream of care that has nothing to do with survival. Your light is a world worth living in. Thank you so much for your attention, everyone. I'm going to close with one more poem. Letter for my future daughters. There was a before and an after. Before the first ravage, after the last man I trusted, I thrashed to the surface on my own. Before your breath muddied the air, there was a time for burning everything. Prisons, courtrooms, unwanted diagnosis, gold towers erected on graveyards, and then there was a time for building a body from my body. There were the times I was told, I wish you weren't born, by someone who loved me and meant it. There were the times I agreed, and there was the time I authored you, a mouth, a fist, a name. I am tired of defining myself as not. Now I am a holy that grows. Every time our brains beat back their inherited burdens, you too will ache like a cavity that cannot be filled. Someone will leave a boot print in your heart, but I will drag your skin open as you crawl back to yourself. I remake me in your image, you who began as my flesh and are now my blood's king. Daughter, you teach me to be borderless. Daughter, everything continues. Daughter, I have kept myself alive, and now there is a reason. Daughter, you usher a new song from my heavy throat. Daughter, we are unroyal, we flinch, cut, flee, grim, weep ourselves hoarse, and still we are enough. We have always been enough. Thank you, everyone.
Wow. Wow. That was amazing, Jody. Thank you. Sorry, I'm a little speechless. I'm out of practice at social events, even Zoom ones. Thank you both, Jody and Maryam. Thank you so very much. Both of those presentations, readings, you each spoke so beautifully. And I feel full, and I feel grateful, and I feel privileged to have been able to be here for this. Also, thank you both so much. Both of these presenters stepped in on a very short notice for this event and just hit it right out of the park. Thank you so much. Jody's book, Sick, you can probably get from your local independent book retailer, or if that's not accessible to you, Indigo, wherever you like to buy books, if that really settled with you in the way it settled with me. Thank you so much again. The first one of these I hosted, I fumbled and I signed off by telling everyone to drink lots of water, but you know what? It's good advice. So drink lots of water. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful.
A wonderful evening, everybody.